Thank you very much, everyone, for attending our webinar today on Australia-Indonesia relations in the twilight of Jokowi years. Firstly, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owner of the lands on which we are all dealing in from today. For me, it is voluntary people of the Korean nations and recognize their continuing connection to land, water, and community. I pay respect to elders past and present, and to all First Nations people whose land we will discuss today in this webinar. I would like to invite you all to submit the questions throughout the webinar in the Q&A box, and they will be answered at the end of the sections. Today, Dr. Donald Greenleaf, Asia-Link Senior Advisor, will moderate the discussion for us. Don is a former journalist who has spent more than 25 years working in Asia. I will hand it over to you, Don.
Thank you very much, Jenny, and welcome to our audience, and a special welcome to our two distinguished guests, Ibu Mutia Hafid and Gary Quinlan. As we all know, President Jokowi is currently visiting Australia in what is likely to be his final visit as president before he leaves office next year. So we thought this is a good opportunity, a good moment to do a progress check on how the bilateral relationship has developed under his administration, and assess where the relationship might be headed to next in the post-Jokowi era. And we have two excellent speakers to take us through that. Mutia Hafid chairs the People's Representative Council First Commission for Foreign Affairs, Defence and Intelligence. She knows Australia well. She has a bachelor's degree, I think, in manufacturing engineering, if I'm not mistaken, from the University of New South Wales. She's a former journalist for Metro TV. Ibu Mutia later came back to Australia when she won the Elizabeth O'Neill Award in 2007, and interestingly spent her time investigating life in rural and regional areas of Australia. We also have Gary Quinlan AO, who is a distinguished former diplomat. He was Australia's ambassador to Indonesia from 2018 to 2021. He also has served as Australia's permanent representative to the United Nations in New York and as High Commissioner to Singapore. Welcome very much to you both. Now, as I understand it, Ibu Mutia won't be able to stay with us for the entire program today. She has been called away to another urgent meeting, but we'll see how far we can get. So I will drop the preambles and, in the interest of time, get straight to the questions. And I just wanted to start off on the issue of leadership, given that President Jokowi is with us in Australia. President Jokowi is overseeing a period of significant institutional growth and stability in the relationship. But if we consider the mix of priorities in Indonesia's international relations, the bigger strategic picture, as it were, Ibu Mutia, where does Australia currently fit? What importance does Jakarta attach to this particular relationship?
First, Honorable Moderator Dr. Donald Greenleaf, and also former Australian ambassador to Indonesia, Mr. Gary Quinlan, and University of Melbourne, and people who are attending this webinar. It's an honor for me to be here and to answer you, Donald, that Mr. Jokowi brings with his delegation today in Australia two coordinating ministers, two senior ministers, and some other ministers. So coordinating ministers, as you know, oversee a lot of ministries. So that is how to describe how important Australia it is to Indonesia. And, you know, he brings a lot of agendas in his visit, as you say, perhaps his final visit before he ends his term in in October. So he might do another visit to Australia. It may not be his final. He still has time until October next year. So as first committee, which is the committee that oversees foreign affairs and also defense and also intelligence and communication and information, we fully support his visit to Australia, and we are very hopeful that his visit will bring Indonesia and Australia closer together, especially in certain areas that he's bringing the issue with, namely in particular the, the green economy.
As you well know, Bu Mutia, Australia and Indonesia have had their fair share of ups and downs, diplomatic ups and downs in the years since independence. Do you think, given the fundamental differences in many aspects of our societies, cultural, social differences, etc., are we fated to repeat the episodic conflicts that we've seen in the past? Or do you think we've reached a sort of state of maturity in the relationship where perhaps we can accept disagreements, differences without blowing the relationship up, without recalling ambassadors, etc.?
Yes, our relationship, Indonesia and Australia, has been like any neighbors, most neighbors will have. Good, close, but with dynamics. So I think it's, that's a normalized situation between Indonesia and Australia. And I think sometimes the dynamics can be good for both countries because like in neighbors, whenever there is dynamics, sometimes it brings us closer together. But what is more important that I view with this relationship between Indonesia, although there are many ups and downs, but both our countries believe that there are great opportunities ahead, and we are fully aware of that. We understand that very well, and both governments, regardless who win during the election, will always have that, meetings, discussion, progress in terms of many things, especially in defense cooperation, for example.
As head of Commission 1 of the DPR, I guess you would be familiar that in the past that when we have had periods of difficulty, it's often the Parliament that's been most outspoken in criticising Australia. To what extent do you think the two parliaments have a special responsibility in maintaining a sense of perspective and balance when it comes to the inevitable disagreements that emerge from time to time? And do you think the growth in democracy underpins the transition in perceptions and the way the relationship is valued on both sides?
Yes, as a second track of diplomacy, I think it's very important. P2P, parliament, not people to people, but parliament to parliament relationship. We have our bilateral group, friendship group between Australia and Indonesia. We don't have that with all countries, but with Australia we have, and it's quite active. Exchanges between parliamentarians are happening quite often between Indonesia and Australia. The senior member, young parliamentarians, including when I came to Australia as a parliamentarian, it was in my, I think 10 years ago, my first term in the parliament. So I believe that parliamentarians have roles, important roles, strategic roles to to make the relationship more fluid. Sometimes when governments speak to governments, it cannot be that fluid. But with parliamentarians, it can be, more open-hearted, more more honest relationship, and we can speak more freely.
Still on the theme of leadership, if I can turn to you now, Gary, you and I were talking the other day about this, the importance of leadership, the role that it plays. When it comes to that, what do you see as the legacy of the Jokowi years in terms of the bilateral relationship? How important has his tenure been to getting to where we are today in the relationship?
Look, yeah, thanks, Don. I think it's been important because he's been able to consolidate the much more dynamic change that's happened in our relationship strategically and how we see each other. He hasn't had any, because he wasn't concerned or involved, apart from the two executions that we had in 2015, he wasn't involved in the earlier phases of relationship where we had such strong bilateral preoccupations. He was freer, if you like, in being able to look more freshly at the relationship at the very time when we were also looking more closely and more freshly at the relationship because of the changes in our region strategically. So both countries were looking at the most dramatic changes in what was happening in the Indo-Pacific because of the emergence of China, but not only the emergence of China, the dynamics altogether were changing. India, Japan, everything, and technological change, ecological threat. So everybody was looking afresh at what was happening in the region and making judgments about what are the implications for us, each country. And it so happened that he was doing that at the very time that we were doing it. And so we discovered as part of that process that the answer to a dynamically changing region with such a level of uncertainty was countries needed to be more resilient, and they needed to have more resilient relationships within a region. And in our case, that meant we made a recommitment to a much stronger support. It's always been very strong, but much stronger support for ASEAN, but also to Indonesia's role within ASEAN. So all those dynamics were happening, and this was at the time when President Widodo was himself coming to grips with what is the future of Indonesia economically. And he started to look around for new relationships economically as well. And he looked at Australia and thought, and it was he and Malcolm Turnbull who sort of accelerated or reopened the negotiations on the economic partnership agreement. And he decided that, there was a complementarity there that was going to be beneficial to Indonesia, and of course would be beneficial to us as well. So all the dynamics were changing while he was president, and he was influential in that, but they were happening anyway in the region. But he was able to catalyse, improved relations with us as a result. So I think it's been, a very good period for relationship as a result of that. And he's, progressively become more of an active president regionally and globally, and has done a number of things which have helped, set us on a better path, frankly, in the region, particularly with rekindling Indonesia's closer involvement, more active involvement with trying to shape the region through ASEAN and improving ASEAN's role.
When you look at these sort of bigger picture things that, I mean, they, as you say, there's sort of trends that are happening globally, regionally, but also, in part they're domestic trends. Do you think that has sort of taken us away from an old habit potentially of looking at the relationship as a problem to manage or a problem to solve, to seeing more where the opportunities are? And is that something that you find happening on both sides? I mean, you and I have been tracking this relationship both for a very long time. And, I'm struck when I think now how far the relationship has come to compared to back in the mid-'80s when I first went to Jakarta.
Yeah, look, I think the answer, Don, is yes, it has, because, as I say, both of us were looking at this extraordinary change happening in the region, both Indonesia and Australia at the same time. What are the implications for each of us? And then coming to the same conclusion that we needed each of us to be resilient, and a lot of that resilience needed to be regional through partnerships, stronger partnerships. And in the case of Indonesia, a strengthened ASEAN, but also, these comprehensive strategic partnerships with India in 2018, and then 3-4 months later, concluding the same kind of partnership, different content, with Australia. Now, this was very deliberate on the part of Indonesia because it was diversifying its partnerships more strongly with key players as it saw them in the region. So all of that was part of that. So I think we both saw the need to do more with each other and to be more active with each other, but also, of course, increasingly the opportunities that presented, particularly in the economic area, which has always been a seriously underdone part of the relationship. But a big part of the reason for that has not only been, Australian business can tend to be very conservative in its global engagements, but also the fact that the Indonesian economy itself was different 5 years ago, 10 years ago than it is today. And it's moving in a direction which is much more receptive to outside investment. People feel more confident and want to be more engaged.
If I can come to the economic issues in a moment, and I did want to explore those. I mean, but just still on this question of leadership, Again, something we were discussing the other day, and this is a question for both of you. How important is leadership rapport to getting things done? I mean, it seems that Jokowi's made a real effort to get on with his Australian counterparts, and he had a particularly good relationship with Malcolm Turnbull. It's an evolving relationship with Albanese, but it seems to be going quite well. And on the other hand, Jakarta's put a fair bit of thought and effort into how to craft this. I mean, some of it might look a little bit like theatre and symbolic, you know, the Belusican walk through a public market or riding around on bamboo bikes, but it sends a useful signal to the population. To you, Ibu Mutia, to start with on that point, I mean, how important do you see this issue of rapport between the leaders in changing the dynamic of the relationship?
Yes, President Jokowi, he's like you said earlier, that how to put this into concrete actions, concrete cooperation between Indonesia and Australia, and he's the president who make more concrete actions. You know, he's not selling concept. He's not only talking about concept, but he progressed. For example, we have campuses, Australian campuses open in Indonesia. We have hospitals open in Indonesia. So it's very technical, but really it creates more people-to-people contact. And also economic, you know, the Mr. Jokowi in 2018 signed with Prime Minister at that time, Scott Morrison, and the first pillar between Indonesia and Australia relationship is economic and trade. And he delivered that by focusing on economic and trade. If we see the numbers, in 2021 to 2022, Indonesia became 10th largest merchandise export market from Australia. And also, he also mentioned pillar number 2 is connecting people. That's why we have campuses open. And if I'm not mistaken, University of Melbourne will open in East Kalimantan, which is a very exciting thing, not only with Australians, but also Indonesia, because East Kalimantan is, you know, the place where we will have our new capital. So if that happens, it really make it closer between Indonesia and Australia.
Gary, can I just quickly get you on that point?
Yeah,
I mean, this issue of leadership rapport, I mean, particularly with Albanese and Jokowi, I mean, it's interesting that they do come both from relatively humble backgrounds. They're sort of self-made in that sense. Do they have a lot in common?
Yeah, look, I think President Widodo himself put it best when he gave some interviews to Australian media in the last few days in Jakarta before he came down here. And although you'd expect him to say good things because he's coming down here, but I think he hit the nail on the head when he said, look, I feel, and I think his exact words were, warm and friendly towards Prime Minister Albanese. I feel close to him. You know, we've developed a good relationship. And he said, that gives us an ease of communication so that we can pick, and he went on to say, to pick up the phone to each other if we need to, if there are issues or problems, but not only that, just generally, and that's how it should be. And of course, that's how it should be with two neighbours like this, particularly given Indonesia's size and importance to us and the fact that it is, you know, the fulcrum of strategic geography in the region, and has been traditionally, you know, had quite an historic role in helping to shape the region. Sometimes with us, of course, on APEC, Cambodia peace settlements, ASEAN regional forums, we often worked together, even when we had bilateral problems. That era, we also did work closely, Australia and Indonesia in those areas. And when you look at those things, personal rapport, not just at the presidential level, leaders level, but also foreign ministers and so on, was really, really quite instrumental. So I think it really is not just important, it really is an essential part of the relationship with two countries like us next to each other.
And sticking to that theme, I mean, you talk about the importance of ease of communication. Obviously, we've got an election next year and we don't know who's going to emerge as president, but we have some front runners already. And I think nominations closed in September. Gary, what's Australia done to sort to engage with the likely front runners? What do we know about the candidates, and what can we expect of them in foreign policy terms, specifically in relation to Australia?
Look, to some extent, you never know. Well, you don't know what you don't know until you suddenly learn more, you know, after you've had a major election and all the rest of it, and somebody has become head of the neighbouring country. But we do know, you know, we follow, Australia follows, and the Australian government follows, and officials, bureaucracy, the embassy in Jakarta follow all aspects of Indonesian politics extremely closely. So we have a strong sense of who they are, and we're particularly looking at what we might anticipate in terms of, you know, foreign policy, regional policy, and so on. Prabowo Subianto, for example, who currently on some of the polling is out front, but that doesn't mean much for any politician at this early stage, knows Australia extremely well. He's a graduate of Duntroon Military College. He's been here. He was here for 2+2 meetings, you know, foreign minister, defence ministers, and so on. He knows us extremely well. We know him extremely well. Anies Baswedan, the former governor of Jakarta, we know well, and he was here a couple of months ago, meeting with officials, think tanks, and others on his part to learn more about us and how we saw the region, what we saw as the challenges that he needed to think about as he prepared himself potentially, you know, to be leader of Indonesia. So that engagement, and that was he was a host of the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, is another indicator of, you know, how we're following things closely. Ganjar Pranowo, we know, but less, I think, than we have known other Indonesian potential leaders. Not for any other reason that he's been relatively new over the last 5, 6, 7 years. We know him, but we don't know him as well as perhaps the other two. But right, in terms of where they're going, I don't think we'll see. We anticipate active Indonesian role on foreign policy, stepped up engagement and leadership within ASEAN, and obviously as much focus as possible as to how you can contain the risk of further strategic competition and tension in the region. I mean, they are such fundamental interests that we don't anticipate there'll be substantial change in that.
Now, Ibu Muti, you're a skilled politician. You understand the political environment there very well. Are you willing to give us a prediction on who's going to be the next president?
Ambassador Gary may know better than me in this time. Because, you know, here, this is the first time, by the way, that the current president, Mr. Joko Widodo, he has a very high approval rating even until now, which is close to 80%. So this is the first time it's happening in Indonesia. So he is very influential in terms of directing who should be the next president in Indonesia. With the 3 names that mentioned by Gary, we might have the 4th person. So because the coalition is not yet finalized, so we still might have the 4th person. So really, as a politician, thank you for saying that I'm a skilled politician, but really at this time, it's so dynamic that we cannot even be sure whether we will have 2 or 3 or 4 candidates. But as in relation with Australia, I'm sure all the candidates will have, you know, it will not be a big change. But hopefully, again, president with result oriented and who has good international perspective, and it is very important, especially on this election, for a presidential candidate to have good international perspective, because we have geopolitical challenges, which is, you know, the tensions are greater than before. So whoever is the next president of Indonesia, I would really hope that that person is not only concerned with domestic issues, but also international issues.
And in terms of that, I mean, the most skilled, most knowledgeable of the candidates when it comes to international relations clearly is Prabowo Subianto. But On the other hand, his career in public life has been dogged by his military service, specifically allegations of human rights going back many years. If he is finally elected president, and I think it's his third try, is there a risk of strains returning in the relationship? Do you fear that? I mean, President Suharto refused to come to Australia for many decades because he thought the inevitable protests that he would encounter would actually end up meaning a visit would do more harm than good. Do you think there's a risk that we're going to go back to something like that if Prabowo were to be president?
Really, Donald, I cannot say much on that because, again, Golkar has our own candidate, and I'm the chief of first committee, but I'm also a member of Golkar party, which we haven't, we have our own presidential candidate, which is coordinating minister Pak Erlangga Hartarto, and we haven't decided yet. Nobody actually has registered as presidential candidate at this point. So really, if I may not answer to your question, that specific question.
Fair enough, fair enough. But look, there are a number of potential sort of conflicts that latent conflicts that are there, and they could emerge down the track. The status of the Papuan province is always a potential sore point. Do you fear that that's a brewing crisis in relations with Australia? The province is still largely closed to outsiders. What do you see as the potential for that to become an aggravation in the bilateral relationship? And is there a role, you think, perhaps for Australia to play in helping Indonesia deal with the situation in Papua?
Yes, with Papua, if again we're looking at our current president, Mr. Joko Widodo, so his focus is on building Papua. He rarely touches on the military deployment there, which is all given to Panglima TNI, the chief of TNI in Indonesia. He rarely give direction on how the military should be deployed, how many, and so on. But rather he's focusing on development. I think maybe Australia can contribute on that, also invest on the development in Papua, especially in infrastructures.
So do you think some degree of opening, particularly to Australian development aid, would be a positive for dealing with the current situation there?
May you repeat again? Sorry.
So do you think a contribution from Australia, particularly in relation to development aid, could be beneficial to helping solve the problem?
Well, you can invest there also. I think our current president are very open with all investment, and not only in other parts of Indonesia, but also, of course, in Papua as part of Indonesia. So I think that can be a good another big cooperation between Indonesia and Australia.
But not to journalists visiting. And of course, you're an old journalist and you could understand why so many would like to actually visit Papua. Do you think that some sort of opening is desirable and possible?
We are building in Papua. So I don't see why we don't invite investments also in Papua.
Mm-hmm. Now, Gary, what's your take on that? I mean, how worried are you about Papua becoming a potential flashpoint and, setting back the relationship yet again, taking us back to perhaps what we might call the bad old days?
Look, I think as far as I can see, it is the only potential significant problem, I think, bilaterally. And it would obviously depend on what happens on the ground. I mean, the Widodo approach of development is a good one, but it takes a long, long time for that kind of development to happen and for the benefits to flow, across the Papuan provinces. It's an immensely complex issue, of course, and you've got activities by armed groups and TNI. So inevitably, it's a cauldron potentially of real difficulties at some stage. So I think it's the only potential difficult spot I can see. There's no doubt that the Australian government position, both sides of politics, has been very clear. To us, the territorial integrity of Indonesia, which includes the Papuan provinces, is fundamental to our relationship. That was embedded embedded, by treaty in the 2006 Lombok Treaty. And can you imagine, if you're thinking of Australian strategic thinkers sitting around at night, thinking about the problems of the world, there's so many at the moment, but can you imagine the extra problems we would have, Australia, if there was any threat to the territorial integrity ever of Indonesia? I mean, it would be such a significant strategic challenge for the region and for ASEAN and for an Indonesia who we want to become closer and closer and closer with. So, that's the fundamental kind of position. But look, potentially, it could always go a little bit wrong because there are armed groups, and where armed groups operate and kill, then you can have problems.
Now, we've been talking about leadership and sort of high policy, I guess, up until now. A significant issue in the relationship is, I think, the lack of buy-in by the publics of both countries. And we've seen, for instance, in a recent Lowy poll of Australian attitudes to foreign affairs, that Australians still rate Indonesia very poorly in perceptions. There's not a great sense of warmth towards Indonesia. I think it rated 57 out of 100 on one scale, below many other countries. What can the two countries do? And I'll direct this first to Ibu Mutia. What can the two countries do to change some of these perceptions and perhaps to take the relationship away from the elite level and to ensure that it has a much broader base with others in the community, including the business community?
Yes, well, that's a pity. 57 out of 100, Donald, yeah. When is this?
That was a Lowy poll that came out fairly recently. I can send it to you. I mean, on a more encouraging side, from there was an ICS poll out of Singapore that showed that Indonesians, I think 87 to 88% of Indonesians admired Australia and thought it was important, and we fared better than many, many other countries. So it seems in some respects the Indonesian perceptions are a little bit more favourable than the Australian perception.
Yes, and I think it should be changed to both ways, favorable both ways, Indonesia to Australians and Australians to Indonesia as well. Maybe one thing, we know maybe why it's more favorable for Indonesia, because we send so many students to Australia and they learn about Australia, they see Australia and come back with good memories. But Australians look at Indonesia mostly from media and Bali, but they see Bali as Bali, not as the whole Indonesia. So I think people-to-people contact, people coming from Australia, hopefully student exchanges from Australia to Indonesia, not only from Indonesia to Australia, can be increased so that understanding within the Australian people towards Indonesia can be, more favorable.
This is obviously a difficult issue for governments on both sides, but I've often thought the missing ingredient here is significant labour mobility, that skilled workers from Indonesia, skilled workers from Australia should be going back and forth. The blueprint for the IA-CEPA, the Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, called for a focus on a range of sectors that were heavily skewed towards services, and that suggests a lot of manpower. Do you think it is possible for the two countries to open up more and to create work-life opportunities in each other's countries, something that's sustainable?
Yes, especially, our president is really hopeful, if I can use this forum to also make a plea that hopefully can be supported by the people of Australia, that our president is there also to speak on the green economy issue, especially on our ambition to become, Indonesia's ambition to become also the hub for electrical batteries, for electrical vehicles, in which we both share some advantages. Indonesia is rich with nickel and Australia is rich with lithium. If we can do that, it's not only business, but it's also to make the world better in terms of green economy and to combat, what do you call that? Net zero, net zero carbon
emissions.
Initiative. So if we can really do that, Donald, and if it's supported by the people, I think we can have, from that we can have more favorable relationship in terms of people and to people through business to business contacts.
But meeting Indonesia's COP26 targets is going to be a huge endeavour. I had a look at some of the official figures that came out of the Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources the other day. Coal still accounts for more than 40% of the energy mix. Renewables are only 12%. Coal consumption has been growing. The Global Carbon Project now ranks Indonesia as the sixth biggest emitter. Is it possible for Indonesia to meet its COP26 commitments?
Well, we're trying, and with the cooperation of Australia, we both are big coal miners. So if we can work on that, and our president is really concerned, and he's really focusing on that in his visit right now. I think that's a good start, Donald. We do have trade relationship, but with investment, we need like one big, project together with Australia, and hopefully that will make it, the relationship between business to business be better.
And that big project seems to be the idea of manufacturing batteries, although as far as I can see, the Australian contribution is likely to be just the supply of minerals, of raw materials. Gary, do you think there's a little bit of an irony here that Australia is supposed to be, under this arrangement, would be selling lithium to Indonesia, but the batteries and the electric vehicles are going to be made fundamentally by power plants that are powered by coal-fired power. They're captive coal-fired power plants, so they can't easily transition. So is there a risk that we're actually contributing to climate problems rather than coming up with green energy solutions by embarking on a battery collaboration with Indonesia?
Well, look, it's an interesting point you make about the perversity of the fact that it may actually lead to increased emissions, but I really can't make a judgment about that at the moment. If there's going to be cooperation on this, then it involves more work, and there's been quite a lot of discussion, I understand, between business and governments and chambers of commerce and so on how it might be made to work. So we haven't seen the details of this. There's some discussions that took place in West Australia in February during visit by senior people from Indonesia down to the West Australian government, because there are quite a lot of lithium resources, of course, based in WA, and they've been working as well to see how it might be able to work. The main focus has been very much, of course, on whether there would be some kind of downstream processing for lithium and so on in Australia to our advantage, rather than continuing to export it. Most of our exports, of course, go to China, and China has the majority of lithium processing facilities in the world, and so there are a series of arguments about whether that is a good thing when you're focused on trade diversification, and also focused on what we can do to help Indonesia become a manufacturing base more broadly as well. So it's an immensely complicated thing. I don't want to sound cute, but I think we need more detail of what could be done, which needs to take into account, of course, environmental impact. I mean, and that's a fundamental thing that most businesses, Australian businesses and so on, now apply in terms of their engagements, because if they don't show that they've paid attention to the global impact of what they do, and I don't mean just in Australia, but offshore, then they run into problems.
I wanted to talk a bit more about economics, but in the interest of time, I might just switch gears and cover some of the issues in the defence relationship and around regional security. And maybe we can come back to the economic issues a bit later if we've got time. But Mutia, there is a sense that I think Australia and Indonesia are moving closer together in terms of strategic defence cooperation. But there are some important differences, I think, in strategic perception. Just give me your take. How threatening is the strategic environment in your perception, and how do you read China's intentions role in the region at the moment? Is that a great source of concern for Indonesia?
Yes, with South China Sea, we do have differences with China in terms of our water. But the challenges doesn't only come from China. If I may be open here, we are also concerned with progressing project of AUKUS, which is initiated America, England, and Australia. Your Secretary of Defense, Mr. Greg Moriarty, met with me on February, explaining about the plan. Well, he's actually just giving information instead of asking for opinions. So it's an ongoing project, and we are going to launch it in March, he said. And Donald, it gives us a more difficult position being in the middle of it. So I think on that issue, on security in the region issue, we need to talk a lot more, so that understanding between each other will be better. And I think aside from Papua, this is another issue that is to be taken very carefully between Indonesia and Australia, because that challenges will come probably next year when this is actually really, happening. So yeah, we do have challenges with China, but we are dealing with it. Mr. Jokowi is also, when they came to our water, he was also very, the gas is very strict, and he made his statement on our ship, saying his messages to China, but also really from our neighbor, Australia. We also need your support to make the region, more peaceful, less tense. And that's by, carefully deciding on our military decisions.
President Jokowi has taken a somewhat sort of publicly, at least, a more sanguine view in recent times of the Quad and AUKUS and the acquisition of nuclear-powered submarines. But from Parliament's point of view, your own point of view, do you fear that these instruments are contributing to a strategy of containment of China, and to that extent can aggravate the strategic environment, specifically in relation to China?
Well, for one thing, it does. It will create arms race and power projection in the region, for sure. So that itself is already a big concern for Indonesia. We don't know yet what's going to happen and how China will react. And I asked your Secretary of Defense to also speak to China continuously on this, so that they won't make any responses that are not favorable to all countries in the region. But really, even imagining that, and then imagining that the thing will come through our water from USA, is already a big concern for Indonesian people. And this is only, it's not, this is a knowledge of parliamentarians, but not many Indonesian people are aware yet about this issue. And I'm just imagining if they know, the people know that this might be an issue that will make favorability to Australians be less among the Indonesian people.
But from a bigger strategic point of view, I mean, to what extent do you think it's important for the US to remain engaged in the region, to establish a multi-power order and to establish strategic balance? Do you see that it remains important to keep the United States engaged, but at the same time minimize tensions and decoupling between the two great powers? Well,
balancing situation doesn't really need to be, introducing armed forces. If you can only talk with China more, maybe that will be a better solution for Indonesia, which is in the middle of it. So I think more talk should be done between also the US, Australia, and also with China.
And of course, you have an economic relationship with China that you particularly value. I mean, there's a lot of, like Australia, there's a lot at stake in having a healthy economic relationship with China.
Yes, like Australia also have with China.
Yeah. Now, Gary, in terms of defence cooperation, how far can we go with Indonesia? There has been talk for quite some months about upgrading defence cooperation, doing more exercises in each other's country, increasing training and education, mutual training and education. And yet Indonesia has a long history of non-alignment and its robust active foreign policy. How far do you think we can go? What should we be trying to do with defence cooperation?
Look, Indonesia itself, of course, is trying to increase, or not trying, is aiming to increase its own defence capacities, its own ability to defend the vast archipelago from any kind of challenge, ecological challenge, all sorts of issues. And it's looking for effective partners in respect of that. And we have had, Australia and Indonesia have had a defence cooperation program for 50 years. And so what we're currently talking about is upgrading that defence cooperation, which is focused very much on training, joint training, joint exercising in more and more complex operations, and also maybe doing stuff in each other's countries to make more effective training. We do some, of course. So that's the aim of increasing the current defence cooperation arrangements. And that's something very much, as we understand it, we want to do, and Indonesia wants to do. And so that's what we're focused on. And in the last, since the borders are open again and the possibility of face-to-face training and engagement has lifted after the main threat from COVID, that's the way in which we've been operating. But with both countries very invested in doing that. Because we have certain sort of capacities we've developed over the years in terms of training, where we have, as I say, a long history with Indonesia in this regard, including in the special forces engagement and training. And so that's really what we're both trying to kind of mobilise to a higher level of engagement. Now, that's because Indonesia itself wants to improve its capacity. We think it's good to have a stronger capacity in Indonesia's own defence arrangements, because that means it's a better defence partner for us. And so we see the advantage of interoperability as a good one. Now, of course, there are limits to any of this, but it's all really about improving the professional technical skills, particularly through joint training and exchanges than has been possible in the past. So it's something we both see as valuable to each other and to ourselves, including there are benefits, for the ADF, the Australian Defence Forces, to be interoperating and doing training, of course, with our closest neighbour, with the Indonesian TNI.
Thanks for that, Gary. Now, look, I'm conscious of our commitment earlier to Bill Mujia, that you had another appointment to get to.
Thank you so much.
If you have to go, we understand.
Thank you, Donald.
Sorry to lose you, but thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us.
Thank you. Have a good one. Have a good discussion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, thanks.
So, Gary, we might move on to the Q&A in a second. But there were a couple of things that I wanted to sort of get to that we had to skim over because of the time constraints. Just still on this defence topic, I mean, how far off are we from producing an agreement? And I remember when we were talking the other day, you said, in prospect, there was something that was sort of quite legalistic, almost treaty-like in status. Is that something that's on the table? And how does that kind of sit with Indonesia's historic sort of desire for strategic autonomy?
Yeah, look, as I understand it, and this is largely from public sourcing, but also from the visit of our Defence Minister, Richard Marles, to Indonesia about 3 weeks ago, I think, in his public commentary about this, he said where he didn't give a timeline. He declined to give a timeline, precise timeline for when we might have an agreement ready, but the anticipation seemed to be that it would certainly be this year. And that's what the aim of both governments was. In terms of its formal status, I think whether it's going to be a treaty or whether it's an agreement, which has formal status, but a slightly different legal status than a treaty, I don't know. I don't know what the aim or possibility is going to be there.
Is it too early for an announcement this time round in the communique tomorrow? They've got a lot of work to do.
Don, I really don't know. All I'm going on is what Mr. Miles himself said a few weeks ago in Jakarta when he was, he'd paid a visit and made comments about this. I haven't heard anything since, but that may reflect my own ignorance, let me say that, since I'm no longer directly involved in any of this. Anything's possible, but I'd be a little surprised if they'd reached that stage just yet, although I do understand a lot of work has gone into this already, and both governments are definitely committed to it.
Do you think defence industry comes into this at some point? I noticed just in a piece that appeared in the papers a day or so ago that before he left Indonesia, Jokowi was talking about the defence establishment being a lot wiser in its defence hardware acquisitions. I think they want to do more homegrown. Is there an area for us to collaborate?
I think the answer to this has been talked about over so many years, and people in Australia in the defence industry have said, well, why can't we do a little bit more with regional players? And they always include Indonesia about that. Look, I think there's an appetite, because Indonesia itself over the last few years has been trying to give a focus under Prabowo Subianto as Defence Minister to developing a more effective defence industry themselves, but they need outside engagement and partnerships to do that as well. And there is some appetite, some interest in some areas of the defence industry in Australia in doing that. So it is possible, but we've got our own pretty big ambitions, of course, under our new Defence Posture Review and everything else to develop our own capacities in these areas. So I don't know what the possibility, for engagement is actually going to be. It's certainly not something that either government would dismiss out of hand. It would be what can be done.
Now, we've got some questions coming in on Q&A, and there's one here that sort of touches on something that I did want to cycle back to, and that relates to electric vehicles. And the question was specifically to you about whether the Australian security community would view collaboration with Indonesia on EV batteries, given China's growing stake in Indonesia's EV industry as problematic. Could it become a flashpoint for bilateral relations in the context of great power conflict?
Well, that's one element that obviously would be I expect would be being looked at fairly closely by those in both countries who are looking at what might be possible for an EV partnership. If you look, for example, at but if you look at what the Americans have done in terms of their legislation to provide assistance to critical minerals overseas, and the further development of critical minerals to which they can have access and others have access, there are very clear restrictions on having partnerships that they will support through subsidy and other assistance, which involve Chinese investment. So that's one thing that's clearly anyone who's wanting to develop a profile in critical minerals, and that includes lithium and everything else, is going to have to look at fairly closely. So it's something which certainly would have to be looked at. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, from my point of view, I mean, the question is sort of very much on the money, because if you look at actually who's investing in the industrial supply chain in Indonesia, companies like Tsingshan and China Cobalt, yes, and whatever. I mean, a lot of that nickel production is being produced by Chinese companies, not under the most environmentally sound circumstances. Even the mining practices, are problematic in terms of an environmental level. That's one issue. But the other side of it is, who ultimately is going to make the profit, control the production process, and it's not going to happen indigenously by Indonesia alone. They're going to need foreign partners for that, and the Chinese are the obvious ones to step up.
That's right. And they're already, as you say, invested in some of the processing that is taking place of nickel in Indonesia. And that's been a very deliberate strategy, obviously, by the Chinese over a number of years now, fairly recently, but over the last 4, 5, 6 years. Yeah.
And they've got some of the, China has some of the world's biggest supplies, resources, reserves of lithium, as I understand it. But for some reason that I'm not, that I don't understand, is that they want to buy all of our lithium as well. They're signing lots of contracts to buy Australian lithium. So they obviously like lithium.
Yeah, Australia, is now the largest producer in the world of raw lithium, but and almost 100%, the figure is 96%. 96% of the lithium we produce in Australia goes to China. And China has almost 60% of the world's processing facilities for lithium. So, I mean, it is a very interesting, set of facts to deal with and make judgments about. I would imagine this is an element that would be looked at in terms of any actual engagement that we would have.
From a security strategic point of view, do we need a sovereign battery making capability in Australia, especially given aspirations to be an energy superpower? I don't know, clean energy superpower. I don't know how we can be a clean energy superpower unless we make our own batteries. And the Prime Minister actually made that commitment in his Perth policy launch ahead of the election last year. And I don't think we've seen much on that front since. But is it very important we have that sovereign capability?
Well, in terms of what the government has done, they, I think it was a couple of weeks ago, they brought down this critical minerals strategy. And that involves, I think it's 500 million as an investment, to give a sort of a bit of a encouragement leg up to Australian producers of lithium, which are mainly small companies, as I understand it, relatively small, who have a bit of problem raising capital and all the rest of it. And there's a degree of risk attached, which needs to be looked at. Whether 500 million is going to be enough, I'll leave it to the experts to judge that. I would be surprised that it's going to have a decisive effect in developing, a downstream capacity ourselves. But I'm not engaged enough directly on that, Don, to make a judgment which, would be serious enough. Yeah.
Okay, now I've got a couple of other quick questions here, which we'll try to get through fairly quickly because we're almost out of time. But the one question here is, what would be the reception from the Australian public if Australia invests in West Papua, given that the Australian public's opinion on West Papua goes against the Indonesian perception towards West Papua? So going back to, I think, what Mutia had said about the possibility of Australia investing there, do you think it's something that's going to fly in Australia?
Look, investment. So you're talking, in the first instance, if it involves government, it's the Development Assistance Program. That's pretty well, there's some small amounts of money under our development program which go to health issues, primary healthcare, those kind of things. And that's in a couple of areas of Indonesia. It's not a major part of our development assistance, which is, reduced over the years. It's now about, I think, 330 million in the current year. But there's a small amount that does go in relation to that. In terms of other investment companies, look, I think that the degree of risk that would be assessed by a private sector potential investor, except potentially in some resource areas, would be pretty high. And I don't see that that's going to lead to anything happening.
Okay, and look, the final question, Gary, and I think it was obviously intended for Ibu Mutia, so apologies to the questioner, but you may want to have a go at it. What do you think of Indonesia's intention to organise ASEAN military drills around the disputed territory of the Natuna Islands? What do you think of the decision to relocate the drills outside contested waters? Obviously, Indonesia's been doing its utmost to upgrade its its presence around Natuna, assert its sovereignty there. What's your take on how they're going about it with military drills, etc.?
Look, Indonesia is obviously serious about the Natuna area. It's within its own EEZ, and the problem and they've responded clearly, quite strongly to incursions in the last few years. It's a few years since anything major has happened in terms of the Chinese fishing fleet, so-called fishing fleet, into those areas, and the Indonesians have responded clearly. They want to build their maritime capacity. This is Indonesia, they do want a greater maritime presence in that area. They know that it's difficult to do only on their own, and so they do want to engage other partners from ASEAN, particularly the Philippines, potentially, precisely for those maritime exercises. And it's their entitlement. I think they will find a way to do this as effectively as they can. But it's a question of asserting presence and their own rights. And I think good.
Okay, Gary. Now we are past our 1 hour commitment. So look, thank you very much for taking us through all of that. Most of our audience stayed online after Ibu Mutia left, so they clearly were keen to hear what you've got to say. So
I don't know about that.
So look, thanks very much. Much appreciated. I don't know if Jenny is still with us and whether she wants to say a few words, but yeah, as I say, thanks very much, Gary, and in absentia to Mutia Hafid for joining us.
Yeah,
and our audience. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Donna. So thank you very much to our speaker and participants today. The full recording of this webinar will be available online shortly on our AsiaLink website and also on YouTube channel. Also, please stay tuned for our coming webinar in July. We will be discuss ASEAN and China relations. Until then, thank you all once again for joining us today, and we wish you a lovely evening.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Thanks, Gary.
Thank you very
All
much.
Take care.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
same to you,
Bye.
and thanks to the participants.
Cheers. Bye.
Right.